briefly on a message that we were taught last year, the 1st of December, about divine direction by the man of God. I found it a profound message because divine direction is given by God, and God is the one who knows the right path for man. The book of Proverbs chapter 14 verse 12 says, "There is a way in which seems right before a man, but it later on leads to death." Proverbs 14:12. And I was really challenged by that message. And indeed, the book of Proverbs 14:12 describes our human nature. There are sometimes we ought to do things without consulting God, without consulting God's servants, the men of God. And those ways may seem right before our sight, but eventually we find them ending up in turmoil, ending up in disaster. Then after they have ended up in disaster is when we come back to God. Then we come back to God for convenience, but we didn't wait for God to give us the divine direction. Praise the Lord. And in the book of Judges, where the story of Gideon, in the book of Judges, when Gideon was becoming the judge of Israel, he was being led through divine direction, and God was instructing him to lower the number of men or the number of warriors who were to go for war. God told him, "These men are too many, and when they will witness the victory, they will say it was their own strength and it wasn't me leading them." Then God was telling him to lower the number of men. As you read through Judges chapter 7, when you read the story, you will see that at one point he told God instructed Gideon to lower the number of men, and Gideon approached the men and told them, "If you feel at some point you cannot make it to the battle, or if you are afraid or you are weak at some point, please relinquish the opportunity to go to the battle." And a considerable number of men surrendered and went back to their homes. Then Gideon insulted God, and God still told him, "These men are too many. Please find a way and lower their number." Then there's a verse there that Gideon took them to the river and told them to drink by the river. Then those men who inserted their mouths directly into the river so that the waters flowing can just flow through their mouths, they were eliminated. And like the people, the men or the warriors who took water by their hands and drank it systematically. Praise the Lord. The book of also Proverbs 16:9. Proverbs chapter 16 verse 9, it says, "We can make our plans, but the Lord determines our steps." Praise the Lord. The plans that we make, yes, it is important for an individual to have plans. Also plans concerning the future. But for these plans to become successful, God needs to give us divine direction. These plans may seem right before our sight, but eventually these plans may fail working out because they were not ordained by God. The Lord determines our steps. The steps that we make, He determines them. There's a song that says, "Oh, rejoice in the Lord. He makes no mistakes. He knows the end of each path that I take. For when I am tried and purified, I shall come forth as gold." God knows the right steps that we make. That's why we were saying last weekend on Saturday that even before we were born, God knew where we would be and where our destiny will be. And also the destiny helpers that come our way. Some may come as a form of blessing us. Some may come in a way that it will be a lesson for us to learn at the end. But God is the one who knows every man's purpose, in this life. Praise the Lord. And also in the book of Proverbs chapter 3 verse 6. Proverbs 3:6 says, from verse 5, trust in the Lord with all your heart. Do not depend on your own understanding. Seek His will in all you do, and He will direct your path. Praise the Lord. Trust in this was wisdom which was priceless from King Solomon. He says that and encourages us that we ought to trust in the Lord with all our heart. And like when the man of God was saying few weekends ago before he left for the meeting in the morning, he said that the church of Peter, the time Peter was being held captive in prison and he was to be killed, the people gathered in the church and prayed. They prayed for God to make a way because the following day Peter was to die. But they were praying, and yet at the back of their head they weren't sure, and they didn't put trust in the Lord. They knew they were praying, but the prayer wouldn't yield much effort until when the Lord indeed heard their prayers and set Peter free. Then as Peter was approaching the church door, then a lady opened the door, and so it was Peter. The whole church was astonished, was surprised, because they thought that it was impossible for Peter to come back. They knew that the following day Peter would be dead. But Solomon tells us that trust in the Lord with all your heart and understanding, and lean not to thy own understanding. Seek His will, or rather in all thy ways acknowledge Him, and He shall direct your path. My version says that he will direct your paths. Praise the Lord. Trust in the Lord. Let's put our trust in God. God is not like man. We put our trust in man, but man may end up failing us. Praise the Lord. God keeps His word. God never fails. Will be there on time to save us. His right hand is always with us, leading us on and on. Praise the Lord. And as I wind up in the book of 1 Kings chapter 17 verse 3. 1 Kings chapter 17 verse 3. This was when the Lord was directing Prophet Elijah to the widow of Zarephath. The widow of Zarephath who fed him. If you read the story, the widow of Zarephath and the son were going to prepare bread, for which it was their last meal for them to prepare, then they died. But Elijah visited the village of Zarephath. From verse 8 says, then the Lord said to Elijah, go and live in the village of Zarephath, near the city of Sidon. There is a widow there who will feed you. I have given her my instructions. So he went to Zarephath. As he arrived at the gates of the village, he saw a widow gathering sticks, and he asked her, will you please bring me a cup of water? As she was going to get it, he called to her, bring me a bite of bread too. But she said, I swear by the Lord your God, that I don't have a single piece of bread in the house, and I have only a handful of flour left in the jar and a little cooking oil in the bottom of the jar. I was just gathering a few sticks to cook this last meal, and then my son and I will die. But Elijah said to her, don't be afraid. Go ahead and cook that last meal, but bake me a little loaf of bread first. Afterward, there will still be enough food for you and your son. For this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. There will always be plenty of flour and oil left in your containers until the time when the Lord sends rain and the crops grow again. So she did as Elijah said, and she and Elijah and her son continued to eat from a supply of flour and oil for many days. For no matter how much they used, there was always enough left in the containers, just as the Lord had promised through Elijah. Praise the Lord. God here showed Elijah and directed Elijah divinely to the widow of Zarephath. If God had not directed Prophet Elijah to the widow of Zarephath, perhaps the widow of Zarephath and her son will have died after preparing the last handful flour that they had. But God directed Prophet Elijah divinely. God is gracious.